This is the Motive Ultimate Expert brake set. SRAM's all-new flagship brake marketed toward everything from aggressive trail riding to World Cup XC. There's a lot of speculation online about how the motives compare to codes, guides, or even mavens, and after 5,000 meters of climbing and descending in the last week, I'm going to attempt to demystify the motives in a single video. There's a lot to cover today, and spoiler, I think these might be one of the best brakes for beginners, so let's get into it. I purchased this set of motor brakes from Imbi Bikes at a slight discount. Imbi is a service and custom wheel building shop in Port Coquitlam, and they've been a channel sponsor for a few years now. It goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways, I have no professional affiliation with SRAM, and neither them nor Imbi have any say as to the content of this video. Everything said in this video is my opinion, and I am not receiving any monetary or in-kind compensation for this review. Videos like this one take quite a lot of time and money to produce, so if you'd like to support my honest and independent reviews, Patreon is the best place to do that. I've left a link to my Patreon account in the video description, and I'd like to thank all of my current members for helping make these videos possible. Now, SRAM is a company that needs no introduction. They're an American bike industry Goliath and likely the second most recognizable cycling brand in the world. But with the introduction of my new Ethos category for 2025, I strongly believe in giving credit where credit is due. If you look beyond SRAM's questionable marketing and OEM sales practices, SRAM probably reinvests the most money back into our trails, sport, and community than any other mountain bike brand. The responsibility report from 2023 is buried surprisingly deep on their website, but it contains a wealth of information as to how SRAM invests its money, and it doesn't just have flowery language and emotive imagery either. It actually has concrete numbers too. I encourage you to read this document yourselves, but I'm going to cover some of the highlights now. SRAM claims that there are three pillars to their responsibility, being advocacy, the environment, and company culture. For advocacy, SRAM spent $9.6 million between 2008 and 2014 toward global infrastructure and accessibility improvements, and an additional $10 million since 2014. SRAM also donates $200,000 annually to IMBA US and Europe for building, maintaining, and advocating for mountain bike trails. They've also partnered with over 250 independent organizations, including many of the trail associations around me. SRAM also provides an undisclosed level of support to their tangentially related World Bicycle Relief Program that has donated over 750,000 bicycles to rural communities around the globe. For the planet, SRAM has actively tracked their carbon footprint since at least 2019. They mentioned that 6 of their 19 company locations run solely on renewable energy, despite the corresponding chart only showing that 4 of their locations do, and they shifted to 100% soy-based inks on all of their packaging in 2018. And they claim that within the next 3 years, they project to eliminate the need for any plastic across all of their packaging, with exceptions for very specific and limited instances. 3 years will be up as of 2026. To give us a glimpse as to the scale of their operation, SRAM claims that they saved approximately 30,000 kilograms of plastic a year solely by switching their brake pads to a cardboard box. With the notable exception of a non-user serviceable clutch, SRAM has a strong service documentation and parts availability, with exceptionally clear guides for anything you could possibly want to do yourself, and a lengthy list of replacement part numbers that a dealer can order from. SRAM also appears to be a decent place to work, and they emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their website, although they do not provide any numbers to back up these company culture claims. SRAM is very much the opposite of a faceless company, with an almost overwhelming quantity of both employee and ambassador imagery on all of their marketing material. They are, of course, not perfect, however. SRAM has a history of inventing new standards when they stand to benefit from them financially. They monopolize OEM spec by offering unbeatable package discounts that push third parties out, and borderline bribery attempts are rampant throughout extravagant whining and dining, and random gifts of several $1,000s worth of parts to key PMs, managers, and executives. Bribery is far from uncommon in the bicycle industry, although in my personal experience, SRAM was and still is the biggest offender of these practices behind closed doors. As they say though, don't hate the player, hate the game. You gotta love some unregulated free market capitalism. SRAM deserves a 7 out of 10 in my Ethos category as a company that I feel better than average about giving my money to, as I believe it is statistically likely to do at least some good. Last week, SRAM officially discontinued all of their dot fluid brakes and released 6 new mineral oil models in their place. That is the DB4, DB6, Maven Base, and the Motive Bronze, Silver, and Ultimate. This is quite the departure from their previous philosophy, where they effectively stated just 3 years ago that dot fluid enabled better performance and mineral oil required less maintenance. I suppose that focusing on longevity and reducing maintenance is a positive thing though, given that many brands have already demonstrated that it is entirely possible to make a class-leading brake that uses mineral oil. But I will cynically await SRAM's return to dot fluid brakes when it makes the most sense for their bottom line. Of the 6 brakes that I just listed, I decided to purchase the brake that is the most interesting to me and relevant to my audience, and that is the new Motive Ultimate. The Motive is a 4-piston disc brake that SRAM claims has level-like weight and code-like power. This carefully worded phrase is technically correct, as the Motives are heavier than the outgoing 2-piston level series, and less powerful than codes when datamed against the bite point, but more on that later. The Motive Bronze features steel caliper hardware and has a bushing for the lever blade pivot. Although I've not squeezed the set yet myself, myself, I can only infer that the bushing lever pivot is going to suffer from the exact same dramatic slop that all cheap SRAM bushing levers are susceptible to, and it's enough to avoid this model entirely in my opinion. The Motive Bronze brake set retails for 510 igloos, or €315. The Motive Silver brake set upgrades to stainless steel caliper hardware and has a bearing at the lever blade pivot. Of the three standard tiers, the Silver represents the best value proposition at 660 beaver pelts, or €404. In typical good, better, best fashion, the Ultimate tier upgrades you even further to titanium caliper hardware and a carbon lever blade along with a clear anodized silver finish. This Ultimate version comes in at a retail price of 800 Hudson's Bays, too soon, or €498. There is a fourth option, however, and that is the limited edition Motive Ultimate Expert kit that you see here today. Now, are limited edition products simply a way for big capitalism to extract wealth from the working class by creating artificial scarcity and systemically targeting the monkey part of our brain that craves shiny new objects? I'll let Gary Stevenson tackle that one, but I think that SRAM has gone about the Ultimate Expert kits in the best way possible. The Motive Ultimate Expert kit comes with a special edition mouthwash splatter colored brake set, 4 rotors, 2 sets of pads, SRAM's Pro Mineral Oil bleed kit with the wrong bleed block, and a handful of other goodies too. This kit retails for 870 sories, or €550, which is barely an upcharge over the Ultimate brake set alone, and represents an objectively great value given that all of it's included here, although supplies are heavily limited. I added up the retail value of everything included in this Ultimate Expert kit except the brakes themselves, and I arrived at a very similar number to the price of the kit itself. This means that if you are planning on buying everything the kit includes, SRAM will effectively give you these brakes for free so that you can have the privilege of being their rolling teal billboard on the trail. Jokes aside, SRAM could have easily charged a premium for these limited edition teal stoppers alone, which is what most other industries would do, but they didn't, and they actually did the exact opposite, so I really respect them for that. The Motive Ultimate is a good-looking brake. It shares the unmistakable design language of SRAM's premium brakes over the past few years, making it a familiar and inoffensive sight. Aesthetically, I think that these limited edition kits are a breath of fresh air in a sea of grayscale blandness. The toothpaste aesthetic won't jive with everyone's bikes, and it was never intended to either. Just like the red Mavens, these teal Motives and Mavens are bold, distinctive, and most importantly, different from everything else on the market today. The caliper styling isn't exactly wild, but the mismatching caliper halves are especially cool, and I'm glad that SRAM fully committed to the bit here, given the recent inability to color match the two halves of their Maven bronze calipers in production. I really like what they've done here with these Motive Ultimate Experts, so I'm going to give the Expert Kit a 7 out of 10 for aesthetics, tied for the highest score I've awarded to a truly mass production brake. I hope that they continue to offer more fun colors in the future. Adjustability, however, is not the Motive strong suit. All tiers of the Motive series feature a toolless reach adjustment dial on the outside of the lever blade with a mechanical keyboard-like tactile feel, and there is no contact or bite point adjustment dial present. The Motives thankfully repurposed the Code brake pad standard, which is one of the most popular pad shapes in existence, meaning that you will have no issue finding replacements from just about any shop in the world. Like all premium SRAM brakes, the Motives have an ambidextrous or flippable lever design, meaning that they can easily be swapped from left to right on your handlebars without having to disconnect and rebleed. This is an especially useful feature for demo fleets or test bikes, and has the added benefit of not having to source a side-specific replacement lever in the event of a crash or other damage. I wish that all other brakes had a similarly symmetrical design. The levers are mounted to the bars using SRAM's standard hinged bar clamp with a single T25 bolt. Unfortunately, SRAM has continued to take a page out of Apple's playbook with their blatantly anti-consumer stealth lever design. SRAM claims that their stealth levers bring the hose closer to the bar, allowing for a sleeker, more modern ride, while the proven internals remain the same, which is decidedly not a performance benefit. There are two potential reasons as to why this interference exists. Either sheer incompetence to clearance check against one of the most popular shifters on the market, or it was done intentionally to disincentivize the use of any non-SRAM drivetrains. Now, aftermarket adapters exist if you have a Shimano shifter, a direct mount one, but if you have a ring mount Shimano shifter like I do, you are simply out of luck, and your shifter will remain in a borderline unusable position that you'll have to move your hand to reach. It's disappointing to me that these kinds of practices are not more widely frowned upon by the industry, and a few millimeters of extra clearance here would ensure compatibility with minimal aesthetic downside, so I can only believe that this was done maliciously to maximize shareholder value. Therefore, the Motives earn a 4 out of 10 for their below average level of adjustability and compatibility. Now, moving on to build quality, and the Motive Ultimates are actually pretty impressive. The carbon lever blade is a nice premium touchpoint, and although it is a bit smoother than ideal, it is surprisingly nice to use in colder temperatures. There's no perceptible play in the lever blade pivot whatsoever, and I found that the geometry and ergonomics of the lever blade were excellent overall, as they usually are with SRAM brakes. Everything lines up as it should on both the caliper and lever sides, and there is a typical amount of forging roughness left on a few select faces of the caliper, emphasized by the teal anodized color. The reach adjustment dial spins smoothly, and all of the threads that we currently used were in good condition. The only noteworthy downside is that the bar clamps are the exact same cheap bar clamps that are present on all SRAM brakes, and you can tell that because they often aren't symmetrical once you tighten them down, with visibly different panel gaps between my two brakes. The Motive text on the lever is also not the crispest either, as it looks like there was a slight misalignment between steps in the manufacturing process. For a mass-produced brake though, I'm impressed, and the carbon lever blade is a nice addition to an otherwise solid build quality, so the Ultimate score a 8 out of 10 as some of the nicest, truly mass-manufactured brakes that I've seen. Setting up these brakes was also a relatively easy task. Imbi generously installed these brakes within 24 hours of me purchasing them, since they were keen to hear how they performed on the trail. Thanks again to Imbi for their continued support of my channel. The Motives use Maxima mineral oil and have an identical installation and bleeding process to the Mavens, down to the fact that they share the exact same online service document. This made setting up these brakes very straightforward, not because it's a especially simple or repeatable process like the Intend Trinity, but because it is familiar due to the frequency it is performed at any given shop. Ben followed the instructions to the letter and achieved an excellent bleed on the very first attempt. I only have 2 points worth noting about the installation process. The first is that my expert kit arrived with significant mineral oil contamination present on the bleed kit box. We assumed that the container of oil inside must have leaked quite significantly in transit, but when we opened it up, the factory seal was still intact. There was no external damage to the packaging that would suggest it was mishandled in transit, so this oil spillage must have occurred prior to the expert kit being assembled, which is super strange. The second point is that SRAM included the wrong bleed block with this Motive kit, shipping mine with only a Maven-specific bleed block that is incompatible with the Motive calipers. I believe that this is likely an issue that the majority of Motive expert kits have, given that the wrong bleed block appears in all of the product imagery on SRAM's official website too. This was pretty funny to discover, and it's not really a big deal if you have a professional shop service your brakes, but it could be annoying if you're intending to work on the brakes yourself. The piston massage process was not performed during my initial setup, as it is and has always been a troubleshooting step and not a mandatory setup step. In order to give these Motives the absolute best chance of success, I chose to run a 200mm HS2 rotor on the front and a 180mm HS2 rotor on the rear. The Expert kit ships with 180 and 160mm lightweight centerline X rotors, a suggestion of intended use, although the Motive series page on their website explicitly shows that a 200mm HS2 rotor is compatible. And they claim that HS2 rotors offer 7% more power than centerline X's at the same size, and 14% more power for every 20mm increase in diameter. As I mentioned earlier, SRAM's service documentation is excellent, their availability of spare parts is admirable, and most shops will be immediately familiar with the Motive servicing needs. Combine that with the fact that the Expert kit comes with the Pro bleed kit included, and the Experts score a 9 out of 10 for serviceability, with the non-limited edition versions coming in at a solid 8. And now it's almost time to talk about performance, but first we need to set our expectations, specifically by addressing intended use. SRAM markets the Motives as being light enough for hard charging XC and powerful enough for aggressive trail. SRAM's media package likely used the phrase code like power and level like weight, as many media outlets use similar language in their own articles, along with a few suggesting that the Motives are aimed toward bikes with 140mm or less of travel, though I was unable to find this claim substantiated on SRAM's website. Now, aggressive trail means something very different in Ontario than it does in BC. So in order to mitigate any specific trail network bias, I always choose a diverse group of trails throughout my testing to form an accurate and well-rounded opinion. I've also spent thousands of hours riding XC in Ontario, shout out to Hydrocut and the AF, prior to moving to BC, so you're just going to have to trust my judgment when it comes to accurately assessing intended use. Despite using Imbi's fancy brake bedding machine prior to riding, the Motives took an entire ride to fully bed in and get up to power, requiring them to be arguably taken out of their intended use in steep, sustained terrain in order to do so at my weight. But once they were fully bed in, the Motives quickly became my favorite SRAM brakes to date. You can pretty easily tell that these are SRAM brakes if you are blindfolded. The lever ergonomics, travel, and modulation will all be familiar aspects to SRAM brake owners. The difference here is that the Motives have the lightest dead stroke force in recent SRAM history, though I wouldn't go as far as calling it beautifully lightweight as another reviewer did. I managed to squeeze a bunch of levers side by side on Imbi's showroom floor and on the trail, and the Motives return spring is notably lighter than Codes, Guides, and especially Mavens, and even their DB8 from my memory. The dead stroke force is still considerably heavier than many other brands, including Intend, Trickstuff, Hayes, and Hope, but at least it is now the same order of magnitude as Shimano and Lewis. I hope that they close the gap further in the future, but this is a very positive step regardless. Now, SRAM claims code-like power, which is technically correct as the Motives feel slightly weaker than Codes in the way that they build up power after the pads make contact. But for lighter riders, I'd argue that the Motives are actually a fair bit better than Codes at reducing rider fatigue, exclusively due to that lower force requirement. Now, let's put this all on a graph because, as you know, I love graphs. This is an extremely simplified approximation of how SRAM's three most recognizable brakes, the Code, Maven, and DB8, actually feel on the trail. The codes are often praised for their modulation, which is represented by a shallower slope on the graph, or a slower rate of change of caliper force for a given increase in lever force. This modulation comes at the expense of peak power, where you'll have to squeeze quite hard to slow down in steeper terrain. Now, the Mavens are often praised by industry reviewers for being very powerful brakes. Powerful is an extremely loosely defined term among brake reviewers, and although it should represent the ratio of output force to input force, it more often than not corresponds to a steeper slope on this graph. The Mavens also have the heaviest dead-stroke lever force in the industry by quite a bit, corresponding to their x-intercept being shifted significantly further to the right and with relatively poor modulation. Although it's been a while since I've tested a pair of DB8s, the lever dead-stroke force felt very similar to codes, corresponding to the same x-intercept, and their output force ramped up at a slower rate, corresponding to a shallower slope. As I explained in my Maven video, different riders require different amount of forces from their calipers, depending on their riding ability, how steep their trails are, and how much they weigh. The overwhelming majority of riders spend most of their time toward the bottom half of this graph, and a horizontal line can be drawn that represents the average braking force that a specific rider commands. The height or y-intercept of this line is dictated by ability, grade, and weight as previously mentioned. What you're seeing here is my own personal line, and since average lever force is roughly proportional to rider fatigue, the intersection points on this line when read from left to right represent the least to most fatiguing options for that rider's needs. In my case, the Mavens give me slightly less fatigue than the codes, although it is quite close, and quite a bit less than the DB8s. Here is where the Motive sits on this graph. The Motive is a very linear brake that is incredibly intuitive to modulate, but it is slow to build up power after the bite point as a result, similar to the DB8, resulting in a shallower slope overall and a relatively high lever force for a high caliper force. Many reviewers in SRAM themselves claim that the Motive is almost as powerful as the code, and from my on-trail experience, I am confident that they are all referring to the slope of this curve while datuming against the bite point. However, the Motive's relatively light dead-stroke force results in its entire curve being shifted significantly to the left relative to all other SRAM brakes. I guess that the difference in dead-stroke force between the Motive and code is similar to that between the code and the Maven. As a result, I experienced considerably less fatigue on all trails, even relatively steep ones, with my Motives than any other SRAM brake I've tested, since the intersection point with my average braking load is quite a bit further to the left than the others. It may sound insane to claim that the Motives are more powerful than the Mavens when comparing input to output force, but fatigue doesn't lie, and this will be true for a portion of riders. The more I rode the Motives, the more I kind of enjoyed them, and I genuinely found that they would disappear into my bike on the majority of trails that I rode, including many on Burke and Cypress, which are notably steeper trail networks than others nearby. However, my enjoyment would slowly disappear when I encountered edge cases that reminded me exactly why I love low force requirement brakes. The Motives were very quick to let me know once they were out of their stated intended use by way of hand and arm fatigue, and they were uncomfortable to use on rock rolls and slab moves, though significantly more comfortable than my experience with codes or Mavens. On the graph you will see that a Motive or Maven always lies furthest to the left for a given caliper force, and as such I cannot imagine a rider who experiences less fatigue with codes or DB8s than either of these two newer brakes. That isn't to say the Motives and Mavens are encompassing the needs of all riders by any means, as I actually think that they are so different from each other that there's a pretty obvious gap in SRAM's lineup, but it makes the obsolescence of the codes, guides, and levels a lot easier to understand. The line that represents your average braking load will determine in which order you prefer SRAM's brakes, and I'd argue that a majority of riders worldwide will be best suited to the Motive, when realistically and not optimistically considering ability, terrain, and weight. Keep in mind that if you can see a mountain from your house, you exist in a relatively small bubble. Now, one of my pet peeves is when reviewers only compare new products to existing products from that same brand, and not relative to other products available on the market. If I didn't know any better, by not having any of the experience I do with premium brakes, I would think that the Motives are the peak of performance from either of the two big players as far as my needs go, and they'd be a brake that I'd recommend for those who do not ride rock rolls, slabs, or select taboo trails. But as soon as we add some of the third-party options to this graph, you will hopefully see that their low dead-stroke force requirement and progressive ramp-up in power results in both excellent modulation and peak power, all while keeping rider fatigue to a minimum. You can have your cake and eat it too, and when it comes to brakes, I cannot recommend third-party options enough. Some of my fastest friends are over 100 kilograms and have no noteworthy fatigue issues running 220mm on Hayes Dominions, while also still getting all of the benefits of a light lever deadstroke and progressive power curve. Now, some riders will undoubtedly need them, but the Mavens should be a last resort, as the doctor doesn't get out the horse tranquilizer if all you need is paracetamol. Overall though, I did enjoy the motives. For most of my riding, they were absolutely sufficient, and if these came on a complete bike and I still live in Ontario, I'd probably just keep them installed. They're extremely intuitive, easy to modulate, and hard to skid, making them a fantastic choice for beginner riders. But since I have to score the motives relative to all other brakes that I've tested, rather than how they measured up to their stated intended use, they score a 6 out of 10 in the performance category. Now, let's talk about consistency. These motives remained perfectly consistent throughout my over 5,000 meters of ride testing. They never wandered, they never pumped up, and they never faded, although my hands certainly did on the steepest trails we rode. I stored them vertically for most nights, along with in my car on a hot sunny day, and near freezing temperatures on the trails, and nothing seemed to faze them. Mavens aside, I've found SRAM brakes to be some of the most consistent feeling brakes over the course of several rides. There's definitely some sample variation present in their production process, but the motives live up to SRAM's very consistent standards. The only annoyance that I encountered on the trail was a persistent resonant rub that happened with the front rotor after the majority of sustained descents.
I can feel it through the bars.
This was always remedied by recentering the rotor within the pads on each climb that it happened on. Symptoms like this one are exactly what the piston massage procedure is designed to eliminate, given that it will likely help mobilize a relatively sticky piston. Since I have no doubt that it would completely eliminate my complaint, I will not be deducting any points here given that the rear caliper never made a peep. However, I do maintain that it is ridiculous that this step is not performed at the factory and is instead expected to be performed by the end user. I experienced no other unwanted noises or pad rattling throughout my testing, although the atrocious angle of the uncut front brake hose managed to turn my wahoo into a wah-ho within the first few rides. If you strictly stay within their trail intended use, fatigue is kept to a minimum, but they are quick to let you know when they are overwhelmed through finger, hand, and arm pain. This results in a score of 7 out of 10 for the invisibility category, a measure of how often you have to think about a given component while riding. Innovation is a tough one. Is this just a rebranded guide? No. Is this just a mineral oil code? Also no. The Motive is a distinctly new brake that, although very clearly SRAM in both feel and aesthetics, manages to cater to lighter weight and lighter duty riders than their level, guide, or code series. The Motive caliper appears to be very close to SRAM's DP8 and the lever to their code Stealth, but the performance appears to be notably different from both. SRAM definitely isn't pushing the envelope here in terms of bold and dramatic improvements, but it is an expected gain for a new product, and as such gets a 5 out of 10 for the innovation category. In terms of reliability, it's always hard to draw conclusions about a new product after only 5 big rides, but in this case I'm actually fairly confident. The Mavens had a few issues in the year since they launched, with wandering bite points and tricky, inconsistent bleeds not being unheard of. The DB8 model, although rare, appears to be an especially reliable and consistent option, along with the Code series, which would indicate that it is likely the Maven calipers causing frustrations rather than the levers or fluid inside. I have no reason to believe that the Motives will be anything other than reliable given SRAM's recent history of making very consistent brakes, and I did not experience anything worth noting here during my testing. I'm going to score the Motives at an 8 out of 10 for reliability, with room to move up or down as always, depending on how they fare in the market. And finally, we have value, probably the toughest topic today. The Motive Ultimates are not bad brakes. Far from it if you truly stick to their marketed intended use, but they don't exactly excel in any particular area. If we look at 3 aspects that SRAM is focused on in their marketing, being weight, power, and price, we will see that Shimano's XTR race brakes make for a particularly interesting comparison. Shimano launched their XTR M9100 2-piston brake set way back in 2018, making it nearly 7 years old now. I'm not sure that Shimano knows what the word marketing means, but they convey a very similar intended use to the Motive series on their website. Both brakes are targeted toward the XC to trail segment, both feature a carbon lever blade, both run on proprietary mineral oils, and both only have a reach adjustment. And both have an identical MSRP in Canada at launch, although you can now find the XTR brakes at deep discounts given their age. The only differences are that the Motives have a toolless adjustment, 2 more pistons, and a symmetrical lever design. The 2-piston XTR brake set does not appear to suffer from the wandering bite point issues that plague Shimano's current 4-piston series, or the shifter interference issues that all SRAM Stealth brake levers have, and I have extensive on-trail experience with the XTR brakes. The XTR brake set comes in at 480 grams for the pair, and the Motives come in at around 269 grams for the front alone. This means that the Motives are likely over 150 grams heavier than the XTR brake set is, and despite their higher piston count, I found them to be noticeably less powerful than XTR2. The XCR lever has a lighter dead stroke and a faster ramp up in power while still remaining quite intuitive. This doesn't make the Motives a worse brake, but it does make them worse value when lighter and more powerful brakes have existed on the market for nearly 7 years at the same retail price. I also don't believe that the lack of power has anything to do with their weight, and SRAM agrees, stating that lightweight shouldn't come at the expense of power, and power shouldn't come at the expense of weight. However, SRAM has apparently optimized for neither variable, as the Intend Trinity, 𝙎𝙬𝘾𝙄𝘼𝙍𝙎, 𝙎𝙊𝘾𝙄𝘼𝙍, and 𝙎𝙊𝘾𝙄𝑇4 are all lighter and more powerful than the Motive Ultimates, albeit a bit more expensive. Hope's Tech 4 E4 brake is within a few grams too, and I would bet that their XCR Pro E4 manages to be the trifecta of cheaper, lighter, and more powerful than the Motive Ultimates. Simply put, the Motives are a brake of compromises, and there appear to be better options available that more effectively serve a broader rider demographic. I'm going to score the Motive Ultimates at a 4 out of 10 for value, the Silvers at a 5 out of 10, and the Ultimate Expert Kit a 7 out of 10, given that you basically get the brakes for free when considering the retail value of the rest of the kit. Add them all up and the total is 68 out of 100, which places them here against all of the other brakes that I have significant experience with. The Motive Ultimates are my favorite SRAM brake without a doubt, largely due to their significantly lighter dead stroke as far as SRAM brakes go. They manage to be good but not great at almost everything, apart from their very likely intentional shifter interference issue that deserves a lot more flack than the industry media give it, and they appear to be a very consistent and reliable option that a lot of people will surely enjoy. I think the Motives are an excellent beginner brake that is extremely intuitive, easy to modulate, and hard to lock up by accident. I imagine that OEMs will eat this brake up, and that the Motives will become the most common XC to trail bike brake on the showroom floor within a few years. I really like that SRAM has simplified their brake lineup, but I just can't help shake the feeling that SRAM has tried to make too many people happy with this brake, and given most riders some level of compromise. The shop score for these brakes is impressive, ranking the Expert Kit in 3rd place among some very excellent options, meaning the Motives are very likely easy to live with. But they fall a bit behind in the trail categories, where their slow ramp up in power holds them back when you're blurring the lines of intended use, or if you're on the heavier end of the spectrum. I definitely prefer options that are a mix of lighter, more powerful, and cheaper, but if these came on my bike and I lived in a flatter part of the world, I probably wouldn't take them off. I'm also excited to see what Shimano manages to come up with later this year, but I probably wouldn't hold off for those either if you like what you heard in today's video. Now, as always, I'd like to send a little message to the manufacturer. Dear SRAM, I know you're watching this video because you reached out to IMBY within 24 hours of my Maven review going live last year in an attempt to confirm whether or not I was an employee of the shop, prior to contacting me directly, something that I haven't told my audience before today. I really like what you're doing with these expert kits, and I really dislike how you probably engineered incompatibility with Shimano shifters, but I'd like to focus my feedback on a single point. My brake review series has gained over 800,000 views since I published my Maven review last year, and not a single person or comment has been able to name an on-trail performance benefit to a brake lever with a high dead stroke force requirement, other than never accidentally squeezing the lever. I understand that your primary sales channel is direct to OEMs, and that solid, stiff-feeling levers will undeniably sell bikes on a showroom floor. I do get that, and it is good business sense. But I feel like you have an opportunity to make a dent in aftermarket sales too with a change in mindset here. If you design a brake with a Maven power curve and Motive dead stroke force, educate shops on the benefits of reduced rider fatigue through SRAM University, and have industry reviewers praise this brake and also educate riders about reduced rider fatigue, it will definitely have the broadest market appeal of your entire lineup. There is a reason why most people never look back when switching to third-party brakes, and I think you have an opportunity here to stop that bleed while also filling in the chasm between your Motives and Mavens. And you better believe that I'm going to be equally critical of Shimano as well once they learn what the word marketing means. My inbox is always open, and thanks for watching.